The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail outside Willow Creek, Montana, in late July of 1876. Marcus Dalton lay sprawled beneath a gnarled cottonwood tree, his worn boots caked with dried mud, his canvas trousers torn at the knee. His gaunt face bore the hollows of hunger, lips cracked from days without proper water, and his hands trembled as he tried to shade his eyes from the relentless glare. He had been traveling for 3 weeks, his money gone, his horse traded for passage on a freight wagon that had abandoned him 10 miles back when he could no longer pay. The ranch hand had left California with dreams of finding work in the Montana cattle country, but drought had dried up opportunities faster than the creek beds. Now he was stranded, too weak to walk much farther. Watching the afternoon shadows lengthen with the grim certainty that he might not survive another night in the open, that's when he heard the creak of wagon wheels. Marcus forced his eyes open to see a buckboard approaching, driven by a young black woman in a simple calico dress, her hair wrapped in a colorful cloth. She was perhaps 24, with intelligent dark eyes that took in his condition with immediate concern. Beside her sat a girl of maybe 12, clutching a basket. "Lord have mercy," the woman said, pulling the wagon to a halt. "Susanna, bring the water canteen." Marcus tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The woman climbed down with practiced efficiency, kneeling beside him. "Don't try to talk yet. Here." She lifted his head gently, bringing the canteen to his lips. "Small sips now. That's it." The water was sweet and cool, drawn that morning from the well at her family's homestead 3 miles north. After a moment, she pulled the canteen back. "When did you last eat?" 2 days, Marcus managed, his voice a rasp. "Maybe 3. The woman nodded to the girl. "Susanna, the bread and cheese from lunch." She turned back to Marcus. "I'm Naomi Washington, that's my sister. We've been making deliveries to the Freeman settlement. You're lucky we take the long route home." She broke the bread into manageable pieces, watching as Marcus ate slowly, carefully. There was an unexpected kindness in her attention, a lack of judgment that made his chest tighten with gratitude. Most people had looked right through him on this journey, another down-on-his-luck drifter, not worth their notice. "Where were you headed?" Naomi asked. "Anywhere with cattle work," Marcus said. "Heard there were ranches hiring up this way." "Not anymore." Naomi sat back on her heels, considering him. "Drought's been hard this year. Most ranches are letting hands go, not hiring. You picked a bad season to arrive." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, the last thread of hope fraying. "Guess I'll keep moving then." "You can barely stand." Naomi glanced at her sister, then back at Marcus. Her expression shifted, decision settling over her features. "Our father could use an extra hand. The drought hasn't been kind to anyone, but he's got crops that need tending, fences that need mending. It won't pay much, just room and board for now, but it's honest work. If this story is touching your heart already, let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and if you have ever gone through something similar. Also, tell me what you would like me to improve in future stories." Marcus stared at her, stunned. "You do that? Take in a stranger?" "My father always says a man willing to work deserves the chance to prove himself." She stood, brushing dust from her dress. "Can you make it to the wagon, or should I get Susanna to help?" "I can manage." Pride pushed Marcus to his feet, though his legs shook. Naomi steadied him with a surprisingly strong grip, and together they made it to the wagon. Susanna had already rearranged supplies to make space in the back. The ride to the Washington homestead took an hour. Marcus dozed fitfully, lulled by the wagon's rhythm and the soft conversation between the sisters. When they arrived, he opened his eyes to see a modest timber house with a barn, chicken coop, and vegetable garden that spoke of careful maintenance despite the drought. Thomas Washington emerged from the barn, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had worked land his entire life. His expression grew stern when he saw Marcus. "Naomi, what's this?" "Found him on the trail, half dead from hunger and thirst." Naomi climbed down. "Thought you could use help with the fencing." Her father's gaze swept over Marcus, assessing. "You know anything about farming?" "Raised on a homestead in California, sir," Marcus replied, straightening despite his exhaustion. "Know my way around crops and livestock both. I'm a hard worker, or I was, before the money ran out." Thomas Washington studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Barn's got a spare room. You work sun up to sundown. We'll feed you and give you a place to sleep. When you've earned enough for supplies, you can move on or stay, your choice. Fair?" "More than fair, sir. Thank you." That first evening, Marcus ate supper with the Washington family around a scarred wooden table. Naomi's mother, Ruth, served cornbread and stew, her movements efficient and warm. There were 4 daughters total: Naomi, Susanna, and 2 younger girls named Grace and Patience. They asked Marcus about California, about his journey, listening with genuine interest. After supper, Naomi walked Marcus to the barn. The room was simple: a cot, a blanket, a wash basin. But it was more than he'd had in weeks. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for stopping, for helping." "Everyone deserves kindness when they're down," Naomi replied. "My father came west with nothing too, built this place from scratch. He remembers what it's like to be desperate for a chance." She paused at the doorway. "Get some rest. Tomorrow starts early." Marcus proved his worth over the following weeks. He mended the split-rail fence along the northern boundary, repaired the barn roof where winter storms had damaged the shingles, and helped bring in what harvest the drought had spared. Thomas Washington was a fair man but demanding, and Marcus met every expectation, determined to earn his keep. But it was Naomi who made the homestead feel like more than just work. She brought him water during the hottest part of the day, always with a smile and some observation about the weather or the crops. In the evenings, after supper, she would sometimes sit on the porch while he cleaned tools, and they would talk about California, about Montana, about the dreams they'd each carried west. "What made you leave home?" Marcus asked one evening in early September, watching her shell peas into a wooden bowl. "We didn't leave. We were pushed out." Naomi's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was steel beneath the calm. After the war, some white folks in Kansas didn't take kindly to black families owning land next to theirs. Made life difficult enough that Papa decided to try the frontier. Montana's got its problems, but at least here we can farm in peace. "That's why you helped me," Marcus said slowly. "Because you know what it's like to be unwanted." Naomi met his gaze. "I helped you because you needed help. Simple as that." As autumn approached, Marcus found himself lingering longer at supper, finding excuses to be near the house when Naomi was working in the garden. She noticed, he could tell, but she didn't discourage him. There was an easiness between them, a natural rhythm that felt like friendship deepening into something more. One evening in late October, with the first frost glittering on the ground, Marcus finally gathered his courage. Naomi was hanging laundry in the fading light, her breath misting in the cold air. He approached slowly, hat in hand. "Miss Washington," he began, then stopped. "Naomi, I need to tell you something." She turned, clothespin in hand, expression curious. "Go on." These past months working here, they've been the best of my life. Not because of the work, though I'm grateful for that. Because of you." Marcus felt heat rise in his face, but pushed forward. "I know I've got nothing to offer. I'm still just a hired hand with barely enough saved for a decent coat. But I want you to know, when I do have something, when I've built a future worth sharing, I'm going to come back and ask you to marry me." Naomi's expression softened. She set down the clothespin, stepping closer. "Marcus Dalton, are you making me a promise?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm promising that when I'm rich, or at least when I've got enough to support a wife properly, I'll marry you, if you'll have me." She smiled, and it transformed her face. "Then I'll be waiting. But Marcus, don't take too long. I'm not getting any younger." 2 weeks later, Marcus left the Washington homestead with a firm handshake from Thomas, hugs from Ruth and the younger girls, and a long, meaningful look from Naomi. He'd heard of railroad work opening up in Wyoming, building the new spur line through difficult mountain terrain. The pay was excellent but dangerous, exactly the kind of work that could build a stake quickly if a man was willing to risk it. "I'll write," Marcus promised Naomi as he prepared to board the southbound stage. "See that you do," she replied, pressing a small cloth bundle into his hands. Inside was cornbread, cheese, and a carefully folded handkerchief embroidered with his initials. "Come back when you've made your fortune, cowboy." The years that followed tested Marcus in ways he hadn't imagined. The railroad work was brutal. 14-hour days hammering spikes, laying track through territory so wild that supply wagons sometimes didn't arrive for weeks. Men died in blasting accidents, from rock slides, from simple exhaustion. But Marcus survived through a combination of skill, stubbornness, and the memory of Naomi's smile. The work crew was a mixed lot: Irish immigrants, Chinese laborers, former soldiers, and fortune seekers like himself. Marcus bunked in a canvas tent with 5 other men, rising before dawn to the foreman's whistle. The days blurred together in a haze of physical exhaustion, swinging the sledgehammer until his shoulders screamed, driving iron spikes into timber ties, hauling rail sections that weighed more than 2 men combined. The mountain air was thin at the higher elevations, making every breath a conscious effort, and the summer sun baked them while winter snows nearly froze them solid. Marcus sent a portion of every paycheck to a bank in Cheyenne, watching his savings grow with grim satisfaction. He'd promised Naomi he would return with enough to build a life, and that promise drove him through injuries, illness, and the bone-deep weariness that made some men simply walk away from their wages. He saw men crushed by falling rocks, others lose fingers to careless hammer strikes, and 3 die when a powder charge went off prematurely. Each death reminded him how easily he could fail to keep his word, not through lack of will, but through simple bad luck. He wrote to her every month, letters full of descriptions of the mountain passes they were conquering, the small triumphs of saved money, the plans he was building for their future. Her replies came less frequently. The mail was unreliable on the frontier. But when they did arrive, they were treasures. She told him about the homestead, about her sisters growing up, about the garden she was planning for when he returned. After 2 years on the railroad, Marcus had saved nearly $800, a small fortune. But it wasn't enough. Not for the future he envisioned. He'd heard talk of gold strikes in the Bitterroot Mountains, and though he knew the odds were long, the potential rewards were too great to ignore. He sent Naomi a letter explaining his decision, promising he'd be back within a year, 2 at most. Her reply took 4 months to reach him at the mining camp. The letter was brief, just a few lines. "I'm still waiting. Don't make it forever. N." The mining proved even harder than the railroad work. Marcus spent 18 months living in a canvas tent, panning streams and digging test shafts with a partner named O'Brien. They found color, small amounts of gold that kept hope alive, but never the big strike that would change everything. When O'Brien gave up and headed back to civilization, Marcus stayed on alone, driven by stubborn determination. The mining camp was a harsh, temporary settlement of perhaps 40 men scattered across the mountainside, each working their own claim with a desperation born of invested time and dwindling resources. Marcus's claim was a narrow ravine where a seasonal stream carved through exposed rock. He spent his days bent over a wooden sluice box, shoveling gravel and water, watching for the telltale glint of gold dust settling in the riffles. His hands cracked and bled from the constant cold water. His back ached from the endless bending and digging. At night, he huddled in his tent, reading and rereading Naomi's letters by candlelight, her words the only warmth in the lonely darkness. Winter in the high mountains was brutal. Snow piled 6 feet deep. Supplies ran short as the pass closed. Marcus survived on beans, hardtack, and the occasional rabbit he managed to snare. Some miners gave up and tried to walk out, only to turn back when the drifts proved impassable. 3 men died that winter, 2 from exposure when they got lost in a whiteout, 1 from fever that no amount of whiskey or prayer could break. Marcus buried them in shallow graves on a wind-swept ridge, promising himself that he wouldn't end his days so far from everything that mattered. Then, in the spring of 1881, 5 years after he'd left Montana, Marcus hit pay dirt. The vein wasn't massive, but it was real. A narrow seam of gold-bearing quartz that yielded $2,000 worth of ore over 3 months of grueling extraction. Combined with his railroad savings and careful management, Marcus found himself with nearly $3,000. It was more money than he'd ever imagined having. He sold his claim to a mining company for an additional $500, said goodbye to the mountains, and turned north toward Montana. The journey took 3 weeks, by horseback, by stage, finally on foot for the last familiar miles to Willow Creek. Marcus arrived on a warm June afternoon, his saddlebags heavy with his savings, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The closer he got to Willow Creek, the more his nervousness grew. He'd left as a poor hired hand making a bold promise. He was returning as a man with means. But would that be enough? 5 years had passed, enough time for hearts to change, for new attachments to form. He'd heard stories of men who'd returned from fortune-seeking only to find their sweethearts married to steadier, more reliable suitors. The fear gnawed at him with each mile, but he pushed forward. He'd made a promise, and he would keep it, even if it meant facing heartbreak. He stopped in Willow Creek first, at the general store where he'd bought supplies years ago. The proprietor, Old Man Henderson, recognized him immediately. "Marcus Dalton? Well, I'll be damned. Heard you'd gone off to make your fortune. Naomi Washington's been asking after you for years." The words sent relief flooding through Marcus's chest. She'd been asking. That had to mean something. What if she'd stopped waiting? 5 years was a long time. What if she'd married someone else, someone who'd been there instead of chasing dreams across the frontier? Marcus pushed the thoughts aside and kept walking, the Washington homestead growing larger on the horizon. The house looked the same, perhaps a bit more weathered, a new coat of whitewash on the barn. Chickens scratched in the yard and smoke rose from the chimney. Marcus straightened his shoulders, brushed dust from his new coat, and walked to the front door. Ruth Washington answered his knock, her eyes widening. "Marcus Dalton, Lord have mercy, is that really you?" "Yes, ma'am. I've come back." "Well, don't just stand there. Come in." She pulled him through the doorway, calling over her shoulder. "Thomas, girls, you won't believe who's here." The family gathered in the main room. Thomas, grayer but still solid. Susanna, now a young woman. Grace and Patience, no longer children. But Naomi wasn't there. "Where is she?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Ruth smiled. "At the Freeman settlement, teaching school. She started 2 years ago when old Mr. Patterson retired. She'll be back for supper." Marcus waited on the porch, unable to sit still, pacing the length of the boards as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Thomas joined him eventually, offering a pipe of tobacco. "You did well for yourself, I take it." "Well enough to keep my promise, sir." "Good man." Thomas puffed his pipe. "She never stopped believing you'd come back, you know. Every time the mail came, she'd look for a letter. Every time a stranger passed through town, she'd ask if they'd seen you." Guilt twisted in Marcus's chest. 5 years is a long time to wait." "It is," Thomas agreed. "But my daughter's got patience and faith in equal measure." "Here she comes now." Marcus turned to see Naomi approaching on foot, a satchel of books over her shoulder. She'd changed, no longer the 24-year-old girl who'd rescued him, but a woman of 29, her face more mature, her bearing confident. She stopped dead when she saw him standing on her porch. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Naomi dropped her satchel and ran, crossing the distance between them in seconds. Marcus caught her, lifting her clear off the ground, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, her arms tight around his neck. "You came back," she said against his shoulder. "You actually came back." "I promised I would." Marcus set her down but didn't let go, his hands on her waist. "I'm sorry it took so long." "You're here now." Naomi pulled back just enough to look at his face, her eyes searching his. "That's what matters." "I told you I'd come back when I was rich." Marcus reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch. "I'm not a wealthy man, but I've got enough to buy land, build a house, start a ranch. Enough to take care of a wife and family. So I'm keeping my promise." He went down on one knee, right there on her parents' porch. "Naomi Washington, will you marry me?" Naomi looked down at him, tears streaming freely now. "Marcus Dalton, I told you 5 years ago not to take too long. But yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in late July, almost exactly 5 years after Marcus had first arrived half dead on the trail. The ceremony was held at the Freeman Settlement Church, with both black and white neighbors in attendance. Ruth had sewn Naomi a dress of cream-colored cotton, and Marcus wore a new suit he'd bought in town. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle with obvious pride, while Susanna and the younger girls served as attendants. Marcus had purchased a quarter section of land 5 miles west of the Washington homestead, good grazing ground with a creek that ran year-round. With help from Thomas and neighbors, he'd built a modest house, 2 rooms for now, with space to expand. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, bought with money he'd earned through honest labor. Their first year of marriage was filled with the hard work of building a life together. Naomi continued teaching school 3 days a week while helping Marcus establish the ranch. They purchased cattle, built corrals and a barn, planted a kitchen garden. The winters were harsh, the work endless, but they faced it together. That first winter, as husband and wife, tested them in ways neither had anticipated. A late blizzard killed 5 of their cattle, and Marcus spent 3 days in waist-deep snow searching for the rest of the herd. Naomi nursed him through a fever that followed, sitting by his bedside with cold compresses and hot broth, refusing to sleep until he was out of danger. When spring came and the snow melted, they found 2 calves that had survived against all odds, a sign, Naomi said, that their perseverance would be rewarded. By summer, the ranch was thriving. Marcus had hired a young hand named Liam, the son of one of the Freeman settlement families, to help with the daily work. Naomi's garden produced vegetables that she canned for winter, and she began teaching her younger sisters to read advanced texts, preparing them for the opportunities she'd never had. The house slowly expanded as Marcus added a proper kitchen and a bedroom, framing each addition with wood he'd cut himself from the timber on their land. Every nail he drove felt like another promise kept, not just to Naomi, but to himself, proof that the struggle had been worth it. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was born in the spring of 1883. A son, Thomas, followed 2 years later. By then, the Dalton ranch had grown to 40 head of cattle, and Marcus had hired 2 hands to help with the work. Naomi had given up teaching to focus on raising their children and managing the ranch's books, her talent for numbers proving as valuable as Marcus's skill with livestock. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus and Naomi stood on the porch of their expanded house, now 4 rooms with a proper kitchen and a bedroom for each child. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Hope was teaching her younger brother to ride his pony in the corral, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about that day on the trail?" Naomi asked, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "When you were half dead under the cottonwood tree?" "Every day," Marcus replied. "I think about how lucky I was that you came along, that you saw someone worth saving instead of just another drifter." "I saw a man who needed help." Naomi smiled up at him. "And you turned out to be exactly the man you promised you'd become. A man of his word. I made you wait a long time. You were worth waiting for." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "We built something good here, Marcus. Something lasting." He pulled her close, watching their children play in the fading light. The ranch that had started with a promise and a handful of savings had grown into a prosperous enterprise. But more than that, it had become home, a place of love and family built on the foundation of kindness given when it was needed most. Marcus thought back to that desperately poor cowboy who'd promised to return when he was rich. He'd kept that promise, but he'd learned something important along the way. True wealth wasn't measured in the gold he'd pulled from the mountains or the cattle grazing in his fields. It was measured in the woman beside him, the children they were raising, the life they'd built together through faith and patience and love. "I have a confession," Naomi said softly. "I knew from the moment I saw you that you were different, not just another hired hand. I saw something in you. Determination, character. That's why I convinced Papa to give you a chance. You believed in me before I believed in myself. And you proved me right." Naomi kissed him gently. "Now come on. Your daughter's showing off for you, and your son's about to fall off that pony if you don't go help him." Marcus laughed, squeezing her hand once more before heading down to the corral. As he walked across the land he'd bought with the wealth he'd promised to earn, he felt the weight of that promise finally, fully kept. He'd told Naomi he would marry her when he was rich, and he had, but he'd discovered that the riches he'd been seeking had been waiting for him all along in her kindness, her faith, and her love. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky as the Dalton family gathered for supper. Later that evening, when the children were asleep, Marcus sat with Naomi on their porch, her head on his shoulder, and watched those same stars wheel overhead. The journey from that dusty trail to this moment had been long and hard, but every mile, every sacrifice, every year of separation had been worth it for this. A life built on a promise kept, a love that had survived testing, and a future bright with possibility. In the years that followed, the Dalton ranch became one of the most respected in the territory. Marcus's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled cattleman spread, and Naomi's sharp business sense kept them profitable even in difficult seasons. They added a third child, another daughter named Grace, and watched their older children grow into fine young people. Hope inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, eventually attending normal school and returning to teach alongside her mother. Thomas proved a natural horseman and took over much of the ranch's operations by the time he was 20. Grace, the youngest, showed artistic talent, filling the house with sketches of ranch life that captured the beauty Marcus had found in the Montana landscape. When Marcus and Naomi reached their 20th anniversary, they hosted a celebration that brought together neighbors from across the territory, black families from the Freeman settlement, white ranchers who'd learned to respect the Dalton's success, and old friends from their early years. Thomas Washington, now in his 70s, gave a toast that brought tears to his daughter's eyes. 20 years ago, I took a chance on a half-starved drifter because my daughter saw something in him worth saving. Marcus Dalton has proven her faith justified 1,000 times over. To this couple, who've shown us all that love built on respect, patience, and hard work can weather any storm. That night, as they prepared for bed, Naomi gave Marcus a leather-bound journal. "I've been writing our story," she explained, "for the children and their children. So they'll know where they came from, how a poor cowboy and a farmer's daughter built something from nothing." Marcus opened the journal, seeing Naomi's neat handwriting filling page after page. It began with that day on the trail, the moment she'd seen him lying beneath the cottonwood tree and made the decision to stop, to help, to give a stranger a chance. It chronicled his years away, the letters they'd exchanged, the faith that had kept them connected across hundreds of miles and years of separation. "You wrote down everything," he said, awed. "I wanted them to understand that good things are worth waiting for, that promises matter. That love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice we make every day to trust, to believe, to work for something bigger than ourselves." Naomi sat beside him on the bed. "You kept your promise to me, Marcus. This is my promise to you, that our story will live on, that what we built here will mean something beyond our years." Marcus pulled her close, the journal resting between them. "You gave me more than a meal and a job that day, Naomi. You gave me a reason to become better than I was. Everything I am, everything we've built, it started because you stopped." "We built it together," she corrected gently. "Your hard work, my faith, your dreams, my patience. That's what marriage is. Two people choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." As Marcus Dalton drifted to sleep that night, his wife in his arms, he thought about the man he'd been at 25, desperate, penniless, with nothing to offer but a promise. He thought about the woman who'd believed in that promise enough to wait 5 years for its fulfillment. And he understood that the true wealth he'd sought had never been about gold or land or cattle. It had been about becoming a man worthy of Naomi Washington's faith, about building a life that honored the second chance she'd given him that hot July afternoon on a dusty Montana trail. The story of the poor cowboy who'd promised to return when he was rich became something of a legend in the territory. Young couples would ask Marcus and Naomi about it, seeking advice on love and patience. And Marcus would always tell them the same thing. Keep your promises, work hard, and never forget that the greatest wealth you'll ever have is the love of a good partner who believes in you when you're at your lowest. As the years turned into decades, the Dalton Ranch became a landmark of stability in a region still finding its footing. Marcus and Naomi were among the first to welcome new settlers, regardless of their background, offering advice on crops, livestock, and surviving Montana's harsh seasons. Their door was always open to travelers in need, and more than one desperate soul found their way to the Dalton porch, drawn by stories of the couple who'd built their fortune on kindness. Their children carried forward the lessons learned. Hope opened a school for black children in the growing town of Willow Creek, ensuring that education wouldn't be denied to those who needed it most. Thomas expanded the ranch operations while maintaining his parents' reputation for fair dealing and compassion. Grace's artwork documented the changing frontier, capturing a way of life that was already beginning to fade as railroads and telegraph lines connected once isolated settlements. In their later years, Marcus and Naomi would sit on their porch, the same porch where he'd proposed all those years ago, and watch the sun set over the mountains. Their hands, weathered by decades of work, remained intertwined. They rarely spoke of the hardships anymore. Those had faded into the background of a life well lived. Instead, they talked of their grandchildren, of the crops coming in, of the neighbors who'd need help with the spring planting. When Marcus passed away at 73, after a full life building something lasting, Naomi gathered their children and grandchildren and told them the full story one final time, how she'd stopped for a stranger dying under a cottonwood tree, how he'd made an impossible promise, and how he'd kept it through 5 years of separation and hardship. "Your father," she said, her voice still strong despite her tears, "showed me that true wealth isn't counted in gold or land. It's counted in promises kept, in work done well, in love given freely. Remember that." Naomi lived another 12 years. Watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren arrive, she maintained the ranch's books until her final weeks, her mind sharp and her spirit undiminished. When she finally joined Marcus, she was buried beside him on the ridge overlooking their ranch, beneath a simple stone that read, "She stopped. He promised. Together, they built something lasting." If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories that will touch your soul.